All right, in our last video, we looked at the trial of Socrates and then how his student Plato wrote about Socrates and extended that into his version of ideal forms, which in particular critiqued art as well. Now, we're going to finally connect this to the ideas of rhetoric and democracy. So I told you before that rhetoric was really important to democracy. In order to defend yourself in a trial, so democracy requires coming together, debating ideas, deciding on laws that are going to be passed, and also defending yourself in court. So the sophists taught these skills of rhetoric, which we can define as the art of persuasion, as a way to participate in democracy. So the sophists, who were these teachers, would charge for this. They would go around and say, hey, let me teach you these skills. I'll teach you how to persuade people, and pay me for it. There's a lot of overlap there in terms of how we think of education today. And we do have a public education system, but that's funded by tax money. And then we have a college education system where you go and pay for that education. So they required payment for theirs. Socrates was diametrically opposed for that. He never charged anyone for anything that he said. It was completely free, and he in fact critiqued the requirement for payment. Now, the other thing that's important here is that the concept of truth is a little different. And I'm using a lowercase t here in contrast with a big uppercase T truth over here. So why am I doing that? Well, if we go back over here, what I say here is that the sophists had a little bit of a different take on truth than Plato and Socrates. So Pythagoras argued, I'm sorry. So let me back up. Corax argued that rhetoric could help one discover what is probably true. Probably true. That's the lowercase t true that I'm talking about. Most likely, pretty certain, probability. And Protagoras taught that there were two sides to every argument and that man is the measure of all things. So is something big or small? Well, Protagoras would say there is no truth to that. It is big or small as it's measured against the measurer, which in this case is mankind. That was their version of small t truth. It depends. It can be tested in debate. It's probably true. It's true for you. It's true for this situation. It's true when measured against mankind. But there was no ideal form, no truth that exists outside of the moment, outside of the person. So there's this great contrast that comes into existence. The philosophers with capital T truth and the sophists with lowercase t truth, right? Eternal, forever, for everyone. For now, for you, probably. Truth versus truth. On the next page, I have this quote from Kennedy, written in 1963. It says, "The disagreement between Plato and the sophists over rhetoric was not simply an historical contingency, but it reflects a fundamental cleavage between two irreconcilable ways of viewing the world. There have always been those, especially among philosophers and religious thinkers, who have emphasized goals and absolute standards and have talked much about truth, while there have been as many others to whom these concepts seem shadowy or imaginary, and who find the only certain reality in the process of life and the present moment. In general, rhetoricians and orators, with certain distinguished exceptions, have held the latter view, which is the logical, if unconscious, basis of their common view of art as a response to a rhetorical challenge, unconstrained by external principles. The difference is not only that between Plato and Gorgias, but between Demosthenes and Isocrates, Virgil and Ovid, Dante and Petrarch, and perhaps Milton and Shakespeare." So Kennedy here is laying out this split, these different ways of viewing the world. In philosophy, there are systems that think of the nature of reality as that of being, B-E-I-N-G. eternal, static, being, and those who see it as a process of becoming, a process of always changing, of always being dynamic. The philosophy versus the rhetoric. Big T truth versus lower T truth. Okay, so how do we pull this together? Well, see here, the dispute between Plato and the sophists is not just about persuasion, but even the possibility of discovering truth. So the sophists are going to say, you cannot discover truth. It's not possible. Whereas philosophers say, that's the point of philosophy. We may not get there, we may not be there yet, but we can discover truth. For Plato, it was the ideal forms. If we can know the ideal forms, we can know truth. Other philosophers have taken other routes. Someone like Gorgias, who is a famous rhetorician, is going to say no, right? I can argue both sides of something. So he has this famous speech where he argues about Apollo being the greatest of the Greek gods. And he extols on all the virtues of Apollo for 20 minutes. And then as he starts wrapping that up, he says, well, wait a minute. What about this problem of Apollo? And then he slowly turns that into a speech about why Apollo is the worst of all the gods. And he goes over all the problems with Apollo. And he speaks on that for 20 minutes. And so for Gorgias, that is a valuable skill. There is no one truth on the value of Apollo as a god. Is he the best? Is he the worst? There are two sides to it, and he has to understand both of those. There is no one truth for someone like Gorgias. And so this is the distinction that's set up. This is the opposition between philosophers and between sophists, who are the rhetoricians. Many of the critiques of rhetoric that were made by Plato and Socrates still impact the field of communication today, right? How do we use our communications media? This came up with radio and propaganda during the world wars, right? Those are used to persuade people, mere persuasion. We still have the word sophistry. It doesn't get used a lot, but when people accuse someone of practicing sophistry, that's an insult in our language, right? We can talk about it today in terms of social media. How are the Russians manipulating our democratic elections in 2016 and even now? How is media being used to deceive people? These are the kinds of critiques that Socrates was making about rhetoric. He's saying it moves us further away from the truth. Now, what does that have to do with democracy? Well, the key here, right? So we said sophists were teaching these skills so people could participate in democracy. Socrates was anti-democratic. Why? Well, this connects really well with those questions of truth that we've been talking about. How do democracies pass laws? You convince the majority of people to pass them. Does that make them just or true? Socrates says no. So democracy for Socrates is no guarantee of the good or the truth. Democracy is just rhetoric writ large. The more persuasive you can be, the more likely you are to win your trial or to pass your law. But that doesn't make the trial just. Hear an echo of Socrates' own trial here. Or it doesn't make the law right. So Socrates thought, right, that the best should rule. And Plato really extended this. He developed an entire system of what he called philosopher kings who were supposed to rule. So they were anti-democratic in that sense. Now, we can see the divisions starting to form here pretty clearly. Keep going back to Nietzsche's typewriter. By the way, I love that typewriter. There's only a few that still exist, and I wish I could get one day, but they're tens of thousands of dollars. So not in my everyday budget. So we have this really kind of distinct setup now of the philosophers versus the rhetoricians. Truth versus rhetoric, mere persuasion. Democracy for the rhetoricians against philosopher kings. So what do we do with this? Well, there's one more kind of interesting quirk that we can put in this distinction. Who were the sophists? Many of them, not all of them, but many of them were foreigners who came from other lands and taught these skills in Athens. Why is this important? Well, one of the questions is, who gets to participate in democracy? We know foreigners themselves couldn't, so they were teaching Athenians how to participate. But as Athenians were founding these democratic principles, they started raising the question, who should get to participate in democracy? And after the failure of the oligarchs, many people wanted to include even more people who were living in Athens in the democratic process. So they wanted to extend it from citizens to perhaps even everyone living in the city. So we might allow the sophists themselves, the foreign sophists, to participate in democracy in Athens. Okay. However, the other interesting piece of history here, and this is a piece that I've only started to add to this contrast in terms of the coronavirus this year, is that ancient Greece had just gotten past their own plague. Now, scholars have debated exactly what disease it is, but that plague had a major impact on Athens because it killed a large portion of the population. The blame for that plague got put on foreigners. Why? Athens, especially more than kind of their rival Sparta, allowed foreigners to come into Athens and participate in life there. So even if they didn't give them full kind of citizenship that allowed them to participate in every aspect of democracy, could kind of easily flow in and out of Athens, decide to live in the city, to make a living in the city, and live there and leave and come back as they wanted to. Sparta, in contrast, was much more strict. They really didn't allow many foreigners to come in and out of Sparta. So, in their war with Sparta, Athens was hit much harder by the plague. And so the plague really impacted their ability to fight that war against Sparta and ultimately crippled their army in terms of fighting this war. So as they were thinking about who to include in their democracy, there was already this suspicion of foreigners, even if it was maybe at an unconscious level, right? Because of the plague that had played a role in that. So I hope we're drawing a picture here of where this line is between the philosophers and the sophists. And most importantly, I hope you can start to see some parallels between our contemporary times, right? So what is truth in this year that we're living in now, right? Think about fake news. Is that truth? Is it mere persuasion? Right? I already mentioned Russia interfering in our elections through their social media campaigns. You should hear that here. And there's also that question of foreigners interfering in our elections. Here, Russians, right? Truth, foreigners, suspicion. President Trump raised this whole notion of building walls to keep foreigners out. In terms of coronavirus, I think that's going to play an increasingly important part of that debate, kind of after we're over the epidemic and pandemic portion of it, right? As things start to move back towards normal, how are we going to think about that? We've already seen President Trump kind of hinting at some of that rhetoric about the importance of his wall in preventing even more spread of that. Now, again, we don't need to get into the truth of that, which could lead us into the politics of that, but you can at least see the echoes of those debates in ancient Greece to today. We're also having questions about democracy, right? Our faith in democracy in the US is very low at this point. I don't know if it's at the lowest it's ever been, but it is quite low. People have less faith in democratic systems than they have in a while. And the wealth gap between the best off and the worst off is absolutely at a historic gap right now. And in the wake of the Citizens United decision, that allowed basically defined corporations as people, meaning that they could contribute nearly unlimited forms of wealth to elections, which has meant that our democratic process has more money in it than it ever has been before. So we don't really use the word oligarchs as much today as they did in ancient Greece, but there is an argument that the wealthiest are those who are participating in our democratic systems, right? President Trump is an example of that, but Bloomberg, who ran on the Democratic ticket but has since dropped out, is just another example of that, right? The wealthiest having the most access and influence on our political systems. Even though Bloomberg isn't a candidate now, he's still using his money to help support the Democratic ticket. So you see this massive amount of wealth, we might say oligarchy, in our democratic systems today. So truth, democracy, plagues, foreigners, all of these ideas are echoed in the moment that we're in today. The question that we're going to think about moving forward is how our media of today impacts that. So we talked about Socrates and the invention of writing and how that changed the way he thought and created the foundations of philosophy. We talked about Nietzsche and his typewriter and how that changed the way that he thought. So my question for you, what is the technology of today? It's digital, but what tools can we include in that? And how does that change not only the way that we think, but what we mean by truth? What we mean by truth. So there's this moment in ancient Greece at the birth of democracy. And we're in a very parallel moment today in the United States and perhaps in many other countries across the world. How are we going to think about it? Ultimately, Greek democracy crumbled, especially in light of not only losing the war, but losing population because of the plague and not allowing foreigners to participate in their government. Now, those were at least mitigating factors in the ending of Greek democracy. So how are we going to think about that in terms of our own city? That's not to say if we make the same decisions, our democracy will end or will thrive, but certainly we have that history to think about. But we have our own media environment, and we have many more years of philosophy and rhetoric in between that. So what is our current situation? What do we mean by truth? Does it exist in this eternal form like Socrates thought? Or is it something more like mere persuasion? And is mere an insult? Is it mere sophistry? Or is that idea of persuasion itself, that process of becoming, what's really important? So as opposed to the being of philosophy, the becoming of the sophists. How can we answer those questions in our media environment today? All right, I'm going to wrap things up. If you have questions about this, feel free to get in touch with me. But I hope over the course of these couple of videos, I've really been able to lay out these differences between the philosophers and the sophists and draw parallels to our current moment.